Hello and welcome back to another episode. I'm Luke, the crazy maker nerd. Last time we accomplished the biggest task, taking 3 World War II planes, one from TEMUI, one Monogram and one Airfix model, turning them into Warhammer 40k vehicles, being a blaster jet, a Dakar jet and a Blitz bomber. They're heavily modified, glued and primed, and ready for paint. This episode, it's time for the payoff. So this is part 2 in a 2-part series of converting and painting 3 historical vehicles and turning them into Ork flyers for the game Warhammer 40k. I'll be sharing tips and tricks to the techniques I used today to achieve a cel shading style, basing them and making the flying base a little bit different to convention. Not forgetting a rather unique way of using decals, which kind of helps you with not needing to do too much freehand. And of course, stolen Astra Militarum vehicles which the Orks converted wouldn't be complete without a lot of rust, grime and weathering, as if these machines are old, recycled, modified and not very well maintained. You know, because Orks. So, grab your wet palette and your brushes. Let's get painting. Starting off with the base coat and wash. So, as you know, previously I sprayed them up in cream and green on the top, using masking tape to mask the 2 sides off. I then went in with some gun metal and I highlighted essentially every Orky bit that was bolted onto each of those flyers. This would later show through very lightly in places where the paint had chipped off from being used too much. I gave it a nice thickish 1 coat all over these pieces, and then I moved on. To make them look like they used to be from, say, the RAF or the Astra Militarum, I went and looked for reference photos of Spitfire camouflage. I then found the closest colour that I could find to the browns they use, which was onyx skin, and tried to replicate that pattern onto the plane. Now, I know the colours aren't 100%, but they're kind of like a 40k style Astra Militarum equivalent. I duplicated the pattern with a single coat all over the model in the places where I need it to look brown. And then I did this for both of the other models as well, on the Spitfire and the de Havilland Mosquito. Next up, I used warp yellow with a stippling brush. I dabbed lightly onto all of the panels that I wanted to be Orky yellow. This was to try and give it a bit of a chipped paint effect, mainly at the edges, because later on we'll cover most of this up. Once again, this was repeated for the other vehicles. Next up, pale sand. So where I went over slightly with the silver or the yellow, I just quickly tidied it up just so that it would look nice and clean. And then went back in with warped yellow and a brush. Now this was to try and get the center of all of these panels, the places where the paint should be essentially less chipped, less weathered for the particular style I'm going for. Next up I got gunmetal out again, and this time I went around and highlighted all of those fake welds that I'd made using the Vallejo plastic putty. Almost as if the panels were originally yellow and then welded onto these vehicles. I also highlighted the rivets all over the planes using the same silver. Now, I needed to tie these into what I'd done before, and I thought the best thing to do would get the dragon red and pull out some of the panels that were maybe laying on top of the yellow panels and make those red, just to try and give a bit of uniformity to all of the Ork models that I've done so far. I also painted a number of the bits of clothing that the Orks were wearing, so they had a similar clothing style to the ones in my trucks. Next up, gunmetal again, this time highlighting the bolts that were on the red panels, as I went over them by accident a few times when painting the red. Next up, matte white to paint all of those white clothing sections. I also painted in the teeth, and on the guy with the fluffy collar, I also painted some of the strands to be white. I then used wild green to highlight all of the definition points on the Ork models, making them look a bit like a cartoon. And I went back to onyx skin and painted all of the caps that the Orks were wearing, so they look like World War II flying caps. Once all of that was dry, I covered the entire models in dark tone. Yes, I know it's a bit of a bodge, but it's not really if you see what I'm doing next. This is essentially to take every colour I've put on and make it one tone darker, so that I can then highlight later on. Now for a unique way of looking at Waterslide Decals. Firstly, I applied all of the RAF decals all over these models, the ones that should have been on them in the first place. Sometimes this involved cutting around certain panels so that they would fit, and other times it was a case of just slapping them on willy-nilly. If the decal was on a particularly difficult section of plane with a lot of texture, I then used Revell Decal Soft on top, which meant it would form over those pieces and kind of melt into place. Oh yeah, and I wrote Ork on the side of one of the planes. I then realised that some of the older decals that I had, where there was clear sections, just looked a bit rubbish. So I went over the top of the clear sections with the two colours of the camo pattern. I also filled in the decals at this point, which is unusual, with some white paint covering up all of the red dots. This was so that I could then put on Ork faces in the middle to replace those dots. You see what I'm doing here? The Ork style RAF logo. I thought it was pretty cool. I don't know, it might just be me. I also remember that there were stripes put onto these planes for the D-Day landings, painted by hand by the RAF. So I thought it would be interesting to do like an Orky version using this checker pattern.
I also put some checker patterns, other logos all over the planes in various locations that kind of made rough sense, you know, 'cause orcs. There were some pieces, however, that split apart a lot, and that's because some of these decals are really old. They're from the early 90s, so they're not as young as decals really should be. So I stuck them down in place, let them dry, and then applied Vallejo matte varnish over the top to make sure that I wouldn't accidentally peel them off with my fingers because they were so brittle. Just like that, where I brushed over the top and it fell apart again. Yeah, this is what I mean. These decals are too old to be used really. Next up, rust and grime. The fun bit. So there's already a rust texture that we put on last time, but we're also going to add a little bit of colour and rust texture here and there using Vallejo rust texture. Mainly around those welds and over the tops of all of the bolts. I just used a sacrificial brush and stippled over the top where I felt like there should be a bit more rust. When it was dry, I got out some burning ore and dry brushed all over that texture and the other rust texture that was also on the planes. This has made all of the planes look really dark and really grimy, which is not where we're going to be near the end, but it is for now. It's just a middle point, kind of the ugly stage. Now we're going to get to the cel shading. This is where those dark colours are brought up again. So firstly, I got out the green that we used earlier and I went over all of the panels, making sure there was approximately a 1 to 2mm edge still where it was showing the darker colour underneath. This was then repeated with the brown used. And then it was repeated for the yellow. The key is to make sure that the edges remain really dark and with the rust showing through, but with the centre of the panel being essentially just the colour out of the pot. This was also repeated for Dragon Red, and you'll notice here I was also colouring in some of the decals, because they too needed to be cel shaded to keep in with the same aesthetic. Once again, pale sand was used on the bottom of the planes to cel shade all of those large panels. Now for some finishing touches. So we're going to take those shell shaded planes and then we're going to add some oil stains where relevant. So I did it around the propeller, various areas like under the wheels, near the guns. And then I went in with some pale sand on all of the bits on the blaster jet. That's because this is where we're going to have a plasma effect. I also went over some areas with some copper here and there so they look more like they would conduct electricity easier. And then I used plasma coil glow all over the places that I painted in that off-white, making them look like plasma weapons maybe standing by. Next up I use Humbrol Clear Fix, something most people probably don't know exists. This is designed to be attached to canopies on Airfix models so they remain clear and don't get fogged up by say the superglue that you might otherwise use. Once they're in place, I use Vallejo plastic putty around the edges to give them a similar rough rusted edge. I also went in here and there with a paintbrush to try and smooth it down a bit. And whilst that dries, a message from our sponsor. It's not really a sponsor.
It's just me. So not many of you may be aware, but I have got a Bamboo Labs Makerworld profile where there are so many free to download items that are designed for wargaming, paint storage, model making, hobby storage. You can check out my profile today and there'll be all of these wonderful bases for you to use the Airfix attachments or the Games Workshop ones for flying bases. You also might have checked out my previous video on the Blood Bowl pitch, which is behind me here, and that is also another completely free download. You can download your Blood Bowl pitch, print it however you want. You may even want to use the pitch design for another game system. They are essentially 1-inch squares that you could decorate however you like. Along with what you might have noticed behind me. So I've been designing all of these Orky storage systems. This is a completely original door that you can download for free. And I've also got door fronts for the cabinets of the Orky storage system from IKEA as well. So you can buy your Orky storage from IKEA, then 3D print the doors using the free download on my profile. These bottle holders are completely modular. They can slide out and then you can change the bottle sizes that you want to use. So say you've got loads of dropper bottles, you can just do a wall of dropper bottles like I have behind me. But if you've got something like a Citadel pot instead, there are sizes for those and a number of other paint pot systems. And if you have any suggestions for other things you would like to see that maybe I would use as well, please put them down in the comments below. As I said, this isn't really a sponsored message because it's just saying, look, there's these things that I've made for free. If you want them, you can have them. So if you want to have some free 3D models, improve your flying bases, your Blood Bowl pitch, or your paint storage, check out Crazy Maker Nerd on Makerworld. Now, back to the painting.
Next up, Vallejo Rust Texture came out again, and I just went over the top of all of the Vallejo plastic putty that I'd painted around the glass. I didn't have enough flying bases, so I used aircraft display stands from Airfix. These come in a bag of lots of different sizes. I picked the largest ones, but they were still a little too short. So I designed some bases in CAD and some essentially fake rock faces I could stick them into, along with an attachment for the Citadel one. I quick 3D print later and some super glue, and I had 3 flying bases ready for my planes. One at an angle, so it looks like it's flying around a corner, and one straight. Whilst of course the Games Workshop one was also straight. I marked up some holes on the bottoms of the planes and drilled them out, and then used a knife to basically open up that gap, and then I super glued the stands into place. Now you can't use Clearfix here because it's not structurally sound enough, so a bit of super glue, and then if you want to clean it up afterwards you can use debonder and a Q-tip. When they all stuck together, I then used some putty to just try and make it look a bit more like a natural rock. And then I super glued on some stones underneath that base to kind of counterweight the planes, which were pretty heavy. And I went over the base with a lot of PVA and sand. And when it was dry, I went over with some more PVA again, just to hold it all down. Now, firstly, I decided to paint those rocks with brown mud splatter. I don't think this is a good idea. It doesn't look, should we say, right? It looks like something else. Then I went over the base with 2 thin coats Goblinoid Green, which I think is probably the closest to the original Goblin Green. And I just covered the entire bases in this green. And then mixed together mud splatter and strap grey to make a dark browny grey to cover all of those rocks, including the one that was looking a bit too brown. Once that was all dry, I went over just the rocks with dark tone to add a bit of darkness and unusualness, similar to how I did the Ork plane. Because now I'm going to go over it all again with strap grey. In a similar way to the way Borderlands rocks are cel shaded in the game, I go over all of these rocks at random little increments and then do this like pattern on the larger rock, which kind of looks like a rock with lots of cracks and facets, which is actually relatively flat, just like the Borderlands games again. Interesting aesthetic, but it does kind of match the plane. When all that was dry, I got out warped yellow and dry brushed all of the top of the goblin green bases, edges of the rocks, including the larger rock itself, so it kind of brought all of the colours together. And then went over the rocks with some strap grey here and there, just finishing it off, adding a bit extra grey, making it look, should we say, done? Yeah, they're done.
So there we go, a Dakka jet, a blaster jet, and a blitz bomber ready for a Warhammer 40k battlefield, done in a weird war aesthetic like Konflikt 47 or Trench Crusade. Overall, I was quite pleased with the end result, and the weird realisation that my Ork style kind of has come from Borderlands, that sort of cel shading art style. Something that I hadn't really noticed until now. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure you hit that like, subscribe and bell icon below so you know when the next video will be up. And whilst you're clicking away, why not click on that keyboard and leave a comment below. I'd love to know what you enjoyed or maybe didn't enjoy about the video. But, as always, until next time, I'll see you later my nerds.
How did you know this plane was almost the longest plane? But then they had to put an extra cone on it. Yeah.
What are you still doing here? Go paint some stuff.